Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. North Korea's diplomatic moves are drawing renewed attention. From closer ties with Russia to renewed engagement with China, Pyongyang appears to be expanding its strategic options at a time of growing geopolitical competition in the region. Meanwhile, South Korea, the U.S., and Japan are also reinforcing their cooperation. So where is North Korea's diplomacy heading, and what could it mean for the future of the Korean Peninsula? For more on this, we connect to Daniel Connolly, Associate Professor of International Relations at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. A very big welcome, Professor.
Thank you for inviting me.
And also joining us is Hannah Kim, Associate Professor at Sogang University's GSIS. Good to see you again, Professor.
Thanks for having me as well.
So let's begin first with North Korean Foreign Minister Choe He's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin a couple of days ago. Professor Connolly, it seems North Korea and Russia are expanding cooperation beyond the military area. What do you think both sides are hoping to achieve?
Well, I think both sides want tangible results in kind of two areas. The first, I would suggest, is symbolic. Both countries are really eager to demonstrate to the international community that they're not rogues, that they're not isolated. Western Europe, the United States, South Korea has been investing a lot of time in making North Korea, an untouchable state, Russia as well. This is why you see in these meetings, both sides are making very visible announcements supporting each other's sovereign rights to defend themselves. This kind of symbolic support is very important because they don't have a lot of friends. Materially, they're both seeking deeper and complementary support. Particularly, Russia has a lot of technology. North Korea has the production capacity and the manpower, not only to support the Russian war effort, but to support the wider Russian economy. North Korea, of course, would love to expand this even more. I think the real issue at the material level, perhaps, is both sides want the better deal. So there may be still some negotiations over the exact terms of these agreements, but generally both states need each other and have complementary needs.
Right, of course. Now, if we build on that, some people in fact believe that Choe's visit was meant to pave the way for leader Kim Jong-un's trip to Russia or another potential summit with President Putin. Professor Kim, do you think that's a likely scenario?
I mean, I do think it's possible that another Kim-Putin summit happens or takes place, but Choe's visit does not prove that this is imminent. Three signals here I think are important. The first is that Choe and Sergei Lavrov held their third strategic dialogue, centered on implementing the 2024 Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty. Second, Putin personally received Choe, and she delivered a message and greetings from Kim Jong-un. So this is also significant as well. And third, the two sides explicitly discussed high-level exchanges, and that's exactly the type of agenda normally used to prepare for a leaders' meeting. And diplomatic reciprocity also points towards Kim traveling to Russia because Putin visited Pyongyang in 2024, and then Kim's last trip to Russia was in 2023. So I wouldn't rule out another summit, but I would be cautious in interpreting whether Choe's visit is direct evidence that such a meeting has already been decided. Now, there were some suggestive signals, but her visit also had many other important purposes. North Korea and Russia have a growing agenda involving military cooperation, the war in Ukraine, economic exchanges, and diplomatic coordination. And as foreign minister, Choe would have many and strong reasons to visit Moscow, even without an immediate summit in prospect.
Right, of course, and we're still speculating on the exact reasons right now. But if we stay with North Korea-Russia relations, Professor Connolly, despite sending troops and weapons to Russia, North Korea is seen by some as having gained less economically than many have expected. So following this latest visit, what do you think Pyongyang really wants most from Moscow?
Yeah, I think Pyongyang is very clear-eyed about the potential for economic gains with Russia. let's be honest, Russia right now is basically locked in a proxy war with Western Europe and the United States. And, Russia's pre-war GDP adjusted for purchasing power was about $5 trillion versus maybe around 45 or more trillion dollars for the US and EU. So there's not really much Russia has left to give North Korea in terms of generous economic aid. But I think Russia's utility for North Korea is very much technological and political. In contrast to China, Russia is a much more kind of risk-taking great power supporter. Russia is more willing to flaunt the international community, more willing to flaunt sanctions. And even if Russia's stuck fighting a war that's lasted longer than World War I, it's still a very good great power to have openly supporting North Korea. And I would like to add, too, there's a bit of an interesting symmetry here. Under the conditions of modern warfare, great powers are really struggling to produce enough weapons. And just as the United States is struggling to produce Patriot missiles and talking about licensing to Ukraine or even leveraging South Korea's shipbuilding industries, Russia's in a very similar situation. It has the technology, it doesn't have the production capacity, and North Korea is maybe a very lucky recipient of this kind of dynamic.
That could tell us a lot about where the partnership is heading right now. Now, if we turn a little bit to North Korea-China ties, Professor Kim, last week China's fourth-ranking leader Wang Huning met with Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang. Do you think it's a sign that Beijing and Pyongyang are growing closer again, or simply a way from Beijing to keep North Korea in check?
I mean, it appears to reflect Beijing's genuine effort to restore political momentum in its relationship with Pyongyang. I think the clearest starting point was Xi Jinping's visit to Pyongyang in June, and this was his first trip in nearly 7 years. And Xi and Kim Jong-un agreed to strengthen political, economic, and strategic cooperation, and the exchanges that followed from this appear to be a part of an effort to implement and reinforce those understandings. And this year also marks the 65th anniversary of the China-North Korea Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. So against this kind of backdrop, North Korea Premier Park Tae-sung made an official 3-day visit to China from July 10th to July 12th. And it was the first standalone visit by a North Korean premier to China since Choi Young-nim's visit in September 2011. And Wang Hunen's subsequent visit to Pyongyang and his meeting with Kim Jong-un should therefore be viewed as a part of a broader pattern of renewed high-level engagement rather than an isolated diplomatic event. And in many ways, this rapprochement also reflects a changing strategic environment. As U.S.-China competition intensifies, Beijing increasingly sees a stable and friendly North Korea as a strategic asset. And China and North Korea share an interest in resisting U.S.-led sanctions, military pressure, and the consolidation of trilateral security cooperation among South Korea, the United States, and Japan. And so their strategic coordination against what they would regard as U.S. containment could therefore deepen. But at the same time, Beijing doesn't want Russia to displace China as North Korea's principal external partner, nor does it want North Korea's provocations to justify an even larger U.S. military presence in the region. So I think this is more than simply China's attempt to keep North Korea in check. But strategic management is still part of Beijing's strategic calculations.
There may be more things going on than just a simple warming of ties. Now, if we look ahead, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is looking to visit South Korea next month, though nothing has been certain yet. So as high-level talks resume, can we realistically expect progress in South Korea-China relations or on the North Korean nuclear issue, Professor Connolly?
For the North Korean nuclear issue, I'm very pessimistic, and maybe this is building on what Professor Kim just said, is right now China is making efforts to solidify their relationship with North Korea, to patch things up, maybe even to compete with Russian influences. It doesn't seem like China wants to risk these ties by making anything more than a token reference to denuclearization when dealing with South Korea. If you look in the past, of course, China has sometimes definitely, I wouldn't say betrayed North Korea, but definitely put North Korea after the South Korean relationship. But those were very different times. And I think right now, the North Korean relationship is to many ways much more important for China than a South Korea that is openly aligning with the United States and becoming even deeper, kind of embedded in trilateral relationships. But I do think there's room for the South Korean-Chinese relationship to see some progress in such a meeting. Especially, I think some of the low-hanging fruit, like cultural and economic cooperation between the two countries, could be a very easy way to continue the momentum that we saw from the Korea-China Leadership Summit. But frankly, our OK-China relationship is very much embedded in this broader China-US competition, so I don't expect any kind of major shifts in this meeting.
Now, if we fast forward to today's trilateral meeting, the foreign ministers of Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo met in Manila, the Philippines, reaffirming cooperation on North Korea and regional security as well. So as North Korea and Russia continue to deepen their relationship, how much further do you see trilateral security cooperation expanding, Professor Kim?
I think there's still considerable room for expansion, but the next phase will probably be operational rather than the creation of a formal three-way alliance. The three countries already share North Korean missile warning data in real time and conduct regular multi-domain exercises. They can now deepen cooperation in anti-submarine warfare, missile defense, maritime surveillance, and intelligence concerning North Korean weapons and troop transfers to Russia. And the Manila's meeting agenda also included economic security. So cooperation could expand into supply chains, advanced technology, and defense industrial coordination. However, political and strategic constraints will limit how far this cooperation can develop. In South Korea, the prospect of a significantly expanded Japanese military role continues to evoke domestic concerns because of the unresolved historical issues and longstanding public sensitivities. And the Lee administration supports stronger relations with Japan, but it's likely to prefer practical cooperation in specific areas rather than highly visible military integration that could provoke domestic opposition or revive unresolved historical tensions. And so the administration wants to preserve room for diplomacy with both Pyongyang and Beijing, but this reflects its broader commitment to what it calls pragmatic, national interest-based diplomacy, as well as its stated objectives of reducing inter-Korean tensions and pursuing peaceful coexistence. So from Seoul's perspective, turning trilateral cooperation into an explicitly anti-China or permanent bloc-based structure could make it more difficult to stabilize relations with Beijing or seek Chinese cooperation on North Korea or reopen dialogue with Pyongyang. And it could also reinforce North Korea's claim that South Korea-US-Japan cooperation constitutes a hostile military alliance. And then this would give Pyongyang another justification for strengthening ties with Russia and China. So I would expect trilateral cooperation to become stronger and more regular and more institutionalized. But the Lee administration will also probably try to keep cooperation flexible and issue specific.
So it will be really crucial to see how it balances the situation. Now, when we turn to North Korea, it appears to have skipped this year's ASEAN Regional Forum for a second straight year. Professor Kim, why is Pyongyang placing greater emphasis on bilateral ties with Russia and China rather than its multilateral diplomacy?
I think in many ways, Pyongyang now appears to see bilateral diplomacy as offering much greater benefits at a much lower political cost. I think this is what Professor Connolly was mentioning earlier about no longer kind of being viewed as a rogue state. At the ASEAN Regional Forum, North Korea will be confronted by numerous governments raising denuclearization, sanctions, missile tests, and its military cooperation with Russia. Yet the forum offers Pyongyang few immediate economic or security benefits in return. And in the past, participation in the ARF still had value because it allowed North Korea to reduce its diplomatic isolation, and it allowed North Korea to interact with a wide range of governments and present its position in a relatively neutral multilateral setting. But today, Pyongyang can obtain many of these things more directly through its bilateral ties with Moscow and Beijing. Russia can provide military and strategic cooperation, economic opportunities, and diplomatic support. And China remains North Korea's most important economic partner and a crucial source of political backing. And both countries can also help shield Pyongyang from stronger international pressure. So from North Korea's perspective, this makes the ARF increasingly marginal. And in these kinds of bilateral meetings, the agenda can be tightly controlled. Public criticism can be limited. The discussions are more likely to produce concrete outcomes. But attending the ARF exposes North Korea to collective criticism without offering comparable rewards. So if Pyongyang skips the forum again, and after its first absence in 25 years last year, it would signal a deeper kind of retreat from broader multilateral engagement.
Right, so it really reflects a broader shift in North Korea's diplomatic strategy, focusing on key alliances. Now, meanwhile, recent satellite images suggest North Korea is preparing a large-scale drone demonstration as Pyongyang speeds up military modernization. Professor Connolly, what should South Korea and the U.S. Alliance focus on?
Right. I'd say the wars in Ukraine and Iran are really demonstrating a bit of a fundamental shift in the nature of war today. Ironically, it's becoming harder to actually use ground forces, but it's becoming easier to hit each other's cities and use this long-range precision strike. So war is becoming less decisive, but also more damage is being done in areas and places that never could be reached before. And I think this is really creating two challenges for the ROK military and the US alliance in general. The first is this idea that you need a mass of missiles, a mass of air defenses. So they have to be technologically good, but they also have to be made in the hundreds and the thousands and quickly. So this is a bit of a technological and an industrial problem. The second problem is dominating what can be called, the 300-meter zone. This is from the ground to about 300 meters in the air that is now being dominated by the very small first-person drones. And this is an operational and tactical problem. And North Korea, which was traditionally at a huge disadvantage with the legacy systems, right, the tanks and the aircraft, now has an opportunity to take a lead in some of these long-range precision strike, the small first-person drones, and South Korea has to really adapt and meet this challenge. And for example, in June, Korea had its first live counter-drone demonstration. A lot of experts criticized it for being very unrealistic or even ritualistic. And I think this shows that maybe the gap between the North and the South is not that great in some of these new methods of warfare.
So it seems to be clear that military modernization is becoming a key concern. Now, finally, before we conclude our discussion tonight, so North Korea-Russia ties deepen and South Korea, U.S. and Japan strengthen cooperation. Professor Kim, how should the Lee administration balance stronger deterrence with keeping diplomacy alive?
I think in many ways the Lee administration should reject the idea that deterrence and diplomacy are mutually exclusive. Deterrence must remain credible, right? Seoul should maintain alliance readiness, extended deterrence, missile warning cooperation, and stronger defenses against cyber, missile, and submarine threats. But those measures should be transparent and calibrated so that they do not automatically close the door to dialogue. At the same time, the government should keep practical channels open, military hotlines, humanitarian cooperation, family reunions, disaster relief, and support for renewed U.S.-North Korea talks. President Lee has already emphasized peaceful coexistence and recently encouraged President Trump to take a leading role in diplomacy with Pyongyang. So the key here is reciprocity, not unilateral concessions. Restraint should be answered with restraint, and verified steps should be received or should receive proportionate benefits. And Seoul should also engage with China to a certain extent, which still has an interest in preventing uncontrolled escalation. So the message is quite simple. South Korea is strong enough to deter aggression, but flexible enough to negotiate, and it should continue to show that.
It will be an important balance to strike moving forward. Now, that's where we'll have to leave our discussion tonight. Professor Kim, thank you so much for your insights.
Thanks for having me.
And of course, Professor Connolly as well. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.